Hello everyone and welcome to another BlenderMadeEasy tutorial. Today we're going to be creating this isometric room building animation. And the tricks that we'll be learning about can be applied to any isometric room. So if you've created your own in the past, go ahead and open up that blend file and we can get started. However, if you haven't, you can download this scene right here. The link is in the description. Now this video won't be a step-by-step guide, rather we're going to go through 5 different animation techniques which can be applied to all of the different objects and models in your scene. If you want a full breakdown of every single step that I did to create this animation, you can find that and the finished blend file over on my Patreon. The link is in the description. First, before we get started, there are 4 things that you should do before you start animating all of your different objects. Number 1, organize your scene into different collections. This is going to make it much easier to find different objects in your scene and then also align the different timings up with your keyframes. Number 2 is to enable the Commotion add-on. You can find this over in your user preferences underneath the Get Extensions. You can type in the word Commotion and you should see it right there. Go ahead and install that. Number 3 is to plan out your animation. What do you want to appear first? If you want the ground floor to appear first, then the walls, and then maybe the desk area and the bed frame, go ahead and sort of plan out your animation before you start animating anything. And number 4 is to make sure you press A to select everything and hit Control A and apply both the scale and rotation to all of your objects, as this will come important later when we start messing around with these scale values. Since the floor is the first thing to appear, let's go through the animation of the tiles moving up and creating the ground floor. This animation is actually going to be pretty easy with the Commotion add-on. First, with your ground plane selected, go into edit mode, then right click and subdivide this as many times as you want in order to get the amount of faces. In my case, I think around this many faces is going to be pretty good. From here, switch over to the face select mode, and then what we're going to want to do is zoom in a little bit. Then we're going to double tap I to inset the faces just like this. And then we're just going to drag our mouse all the way out and left click to confirm that action. Now right now we have a lot of doubles in our scene, so let's invert the selection by hitting Control I, press X, and then delete the faces. From here, press A to select everything, P, and then go by loose parts. And that's going to allow all of these objects to be separated just like this. From here, box select everything, right click, set origin to geometry, and now each of these have the origin point right at the center. And now with this, we are ready to start animating. For this scene, we're going to drag our cursor to frame 20, position all of these objects below the floor, just like this, so they disappear, then hit K and add in a location keyframe. We're then going to jump 10 frames later, drag all of the tiles up so that they're above the floor, then hit K again and add in another location keyframe. 20 frames later, we'll drag everything back down to its original position, resting right on the ground floor. Right about there is good, and then add in that last location keyframe. Now here's what the animation looks like right now, but it's not that interesting. So let's offset all of the animation to create that cool effect. First, position your cursor right at the frame beginning, which is frame 20. And the other thing that we're going to do is place our 3D cursor right at the center of all of these objects. You can do this by hitting Shift S and go cursor to selected. Then in the Properties tab by hitting N, we're going to jump over to the Commotions tab. First, make sure you sort by the cursor rather than name. Then for the offset value and threshold, the threshold is the amount of objects. And since I have an even number right here at the cursor, I'm going to do 4 tiles here. So I'm going to set the threshold up to 4. And the offset value is how many frames it's going to offset all of the objects. In my case, we want to go much lower, down to around 0.1 or 0.2. Now with those 2 values, you can click on Offset Animation. And now in the timeline, you're going to see all of these different keyframes. But the effect, if we now play our animation, you can see the tiles are moving upwards in a wave pattern. If you don't want the middle part to be the beginning, you can place your cursor on one of the corners, offset the animation, and then you get this sort of effect. So feel free to play around with it to get the look that you want. The next animation technique we're going to go through is called Overshoot and Settle, and it basically refers to an object overshooting its original position and then moving and settling back in. Now this is very easy to do in Blender, and it really gives your animation a much more springier and flowy look. And with these walls, that is the effect that we're going to create. First, we'll do the wall on the left here. We'll go into edit mode. We'll box select the bottom vertices here, Shift S and go cursor to selected so our cursor is right at the bottom. Then we're going to move the origin point to our 3D cursor. So right click, set origin to 3D cursor. From here, we can open up the properties tab. Underneath the item tab, we can play around with the scale values. Let's jump to frame 50 here and set the Z scale down to 0, then hit K and then add in a scale keyframe. 20 frames later, we'll jump to frame 70 here. We're going to set the scale over 1, so we'll go 1.05, then add in another scale keyframe. Then we'll go 5 frames later to 75, bring the scale back down to 1, and then add in that last keyframe right here. So here's the effect that we get. So you can see it does a little bounce right at the top, and that will give a much more organic looking animation as everything is playing. We'll do the same thing over on this wall. First, we need to position the cursor at the bottom here. So in edit mode, select the bottom edge there, cursor to selected, then right click, set origin to 3D cursor. Now we don't want to have to go through and create the entire animation again. So what we can do is hold shift, select the original wall with the animation, hit Control L, and then go link animation data. Now you can see here, it has that same animation. Doing this though will link these keyframes together, so if you change one of them, the other one will also change, which I don't really want. So to fix that, go up to Object, down to Relations, Make Single User, and then select Object Animation. So now what we can do is move these keyframes around a little bit so that they have a different offset value, and it's not going to affect the original wall. For the door object, we can do something similar by going into edit mode, selecting that corner right there, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then we'll position the origin point right at that 3D cursor. What I want for the door is I want it to rotate in after it scales upwards. So let's bring the cursor to around 68 or so. We'll rotate the door along the Z axis so it's open. Then we'll set the Z scale to 0, hit K, add in both a rotation and scale value. Then we'll go 10 frames later to 78, set the scale up to 1.05, hit K, add in another rotation and scale value. 5 frames later, we'll bring the scale back down to 1, add that other keyframe again, then we'll rotate it in by going 20 frames later, set the rotation to 0, and then add in that last rotation keyframe like this. So here is the effect that we get, and then the door closes. For the window object, you can do something very similar with some rotation and scale keyframes. Basically just scale it up, add in a location keyframe, and then bring it into the window frame. Here's what our animation looks like now with all of the different objects. You can see it is looking pretty good. Now taking a look at this interior, you can clearly see that it's a very stylized render. It's not supposed to be super realistic, it's low poly, and it doesn't look like a real image. However, if you're wanting to learn how to create a realistic interior, you can check out my class on Skillshare, Create and Design a Modern Interior in Blender, where we go through the entire process starting out with the default cube and ending with this beautiful interior shot completely done in Blender. From lighting, texturing, creating the materials, and adding different models to the scene, you'll learn what it takes to create this realistic interior shot and render it in both EEVEE and in cycles. And since Skillshare is sponsoring this video, you can view this class for free for an entire month. If you don't know what Skillshare is, it's an online learning platform with thousands of professionally taught classes on every topic that you can think of. They've got classes on illustration, animation, photography, graphic design, and of course, Blender. In fact, there's a huge selection of Blender classes as well as 9 that I've created myself. The first 500 people to click the link in the description or scan the QR code right here will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. That means you have access to the entire library on the platform with 0 ads so you can study and learn completely uninterrupted. Big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the tutorial. The next animation technique we're going to go through is having this desk mat roll out using a curve modifier. To do this, first go up to your preferences in the edit menu, go over to the add-ons and make sure you have the extra curve objects add-on enabled, as this will give us a lot more options for adding different curves. From here, with your mat selected, place your cursor right at the center. We'll press Shift A, go over to curve, and then we're going to come down here to these spirals and then add an Archimedean curve right here. Then in the bottom menu, let's change a couple of the settings to get the actual spiral that we want. First, for the radius growth, let's go with a negative value of -0.1. And then for the amount of turns, let's bring this up until we get the look that we want. Somewhere around there is going to be pretty good. In object mode, let's rotate this along the x-axis by -90 degrees. And then in the front view, let's scale this down and then place it here at the start where we want the mat to actually roll out. So somewhere around there is good. Then I also want to rotate this so that the bottom vertex is pointed in the X direction. And then in edit mode, let's select that bottom vertex, press E to extrude, and lock it to the X axis. As this is important, if there is any rotation value like this, your mat is not going to lay flat on the ground. So make sure you extrude it along the X so it's completely flat. From here, press Ctrl A and apply the rotation and scale value to this curve object. Then with this object selected, let's go into edit mode. We first need to add in a little bit more geometry so it can rotate around the spiral. We'll press Ctrl R and add in a couple of loop cuts. Somewhere around there is pretty good. Then you can left click and right click. At this point, you can jump over to the modifier tab, select deform, and add in a curve modifier. For the curve object, of course, we're going to select the spiral. And now what happens is if we press G and then X, you're going to see it rotates along the spiral just like this. Now, one thing that happened though is that our scale is now way off. So an easy fix for that is just press S, then Y, and scale it out until you get the size of mat that you need. Somewhere around there is good. And now basically you can select your spiral, press G and X, and move it along here. But you're going to notice it's rotating the wrong way. An easy fix for this is to go into edit mode, A to select everything, right click, and we need to switch the direction of our curve. So select switch direction. From here we can select our object, rotate it out so it's right about there, drag it back a little bit. And now if we select our spiral, we can press G, then X, and you're going to see we get this roll out effect. For this object, again, I want to use the Overshoot and Settle effect, but unfortunately, if we try to scale this object, you're going to see it creates this effect, which we don't really want. We want the whole thing to scale evenly. One way to fix that is first select your spiral, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then we can add another object to control the scale. So let's press Shift A, go over to empty, and then add in a plane axis. From here, select both the spiral, the mat, and the empty last, Control P, and then go Object. So now when we scale the empty, you're going to see that it scales evenly. Then from here, we can just add in those different keyframes. As for the chair and desk objects, you can use the same Overshoot and Settle with the scale. And then for the objects that are on top of the desk, basically just add in a keyframe with all of them above the room, and then around 10 or 15 frames later, drop them down, and then you can offset the animation. So here is our full animation now. We have the floor, the ground, the window and door, the mat, and then all of the objects fall down. The next thing we're going to talk about is the bed and cloth simulation. What I want for this is the same scale and overshoot for all of these objects, but then I want a plane to scale outwards and then fall down using the cloth simulation. So first, I'm going to go ahead and add in all of the scale values, and then we'll work on the cloth simulation. All of the objects now have their animation of them appearing in the scene, so let's work on the cloth simulation now. I'm going to press Shift A and go over to Mesh and then add in a plane object. Scale the plane down just a little bit, drag it upwards, and I'm going to scale it along the X so it's a little bit skinnier. Place it somewhere around here or so. For the cloth simulation to work properly, we need to have a lot more geometry on our mesh here. You can see at the moment we only have 4 vertices. So to fix that, in edit mode, let's right click, subdivide, and we'll do this a couple of times till we get the amount of geometry that we want. Somewhere around here is pretty good. I might scale the entire thing down slightly, and then make sure you press Ctrl A and apply the scale to your new mesh plane here. The next thing that we need to do is add collision to the pillows, the bed frame, and the mattress. So with all of them selected here, over in the physics panel, holding the Alt key, let's select collision here. And if you held the Alt key, now they should all have the collision modifier applied to them. Now before we add the claw simulation to our plane here, let's do the overshoot and settle on these scale values with this object as well. So probably around frame 150, we'll set the scale to 0, press K, add in a scale keyframe. 10 frames later, we'll set the scale up to 1.05, add in another scale keyframe, and then 5 frames later, we'll bring the scale back down to 1 and then add in that last keyframe. So on frame 166 is when we want the claw simulation to actually start. Over in the physics tab, let's enable cloth, and the first thing that we will do is set the start frame to 166, and then the end frame we'll leave at 256 for now, but we will change this after we see how long this animation is. So let's play this and see what it looks like with the default settings, and you can see that actually looks pretty good. One thing that we will want to change is over here in the collisions tab, you're going to see there is a very large gap between the surface of the pillows and the actual cloth itself. We can fix that by changing the object collision. Let's go much lower, down to 0.00 and 1. Now if we play the simulation now, we can see this is much closer and that is looking a lot better. I think around 181 is actually a pretty good number, so let's set the end frame here to match that. Let's go with 185. We'll play that one last time to double check that everything is looking good, which it is, so let's go ahead and bake the simulation. With those 4 techniques out of the way, we're ready to start animating the rest of the objects in the scene. For the plant object, you can animate the scale of the pot, which will scale the entire thing. And then with the pivot point set to the individual origins, you can do the same thing for the leaves to create this growing effect. And then obviously you can use the Commotion add-on to offset the animation. One tip that I have here is to make sure you hold the Alt key when setting the scale in the Properties tab. If you do this, it'll change the scale for all of the objects that you have selected. The bookshelf and books are the exact same, except this time you can add rotation and location keyframes as well. Scale, rotate, and move them into the shelf, and then offset the animation. For the lamp, you can animate the strength by clicking the button on the side, and you can go from 1 to 4 or something like that to create the look of the lamp actually turning on. And for the rest of the objects, it's a very similar effect. You can either use scale keyframes, location keyframes, bring them into the shot however you like. Feel free to get creative and use whatever technique that you want to create your animations. I also recommend constantly restarting the timeline so you can see how all of the objects interact with each other and making sure that the timing of each object is correct. So from here, we need to find when we want all the objects to start disappearing. And for my animation, I found that around 340 is pretty good. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to fix this cloth simulation. Because at the moment, if we try to scale, it's not going to do anything. So basically what we're going to do is actually press Shift D on this object. And we will also want to make sure this is baked in. So let's bake in that new object here. And so now that we have 2 different planes, we're going to apply the claw simulation to one of them and hide the other one from the render on a certain frame. So with the new plane selected, 1027, let's come over to the modifier tab and apply this modifier here. So now we can move this object around, scale it however we want. On frame 320 here, let's come over here and we'll hit I while hovering over the plane object here, the first one with the claw simulation. We'll hide the new one from the render, add in a keyframe, and then we're basically going to swap them. So on frame 321, let's hide the one that has the claw simulation, and then we'll re-enable the one without the claw simulation, and now they're swapped. And then at this point on frame 340, we can start scaling all of the objects down. What I'm going to do is place my cursor over here on the right side because this is when I want the animation to start. I want all of these objects to slowly disappear as the animation goes across. Next, we need to select all of the objects that we want to scale down. In this case, it's basically everything except for the window frame. We're going to be scaling the empty object here and also the empty object for our mat here. We don't want to scale this object or the spiral or anything like that. So what we'll do is we'll press A to select everything, and then I'm going to deselect by pressing B with the middle mouse button, deselect the spiral, and then we'll just deselect the mat right there and make sure that tile is selected. And then we're going to come over here. We don't want to select the window frame either. So I'm just going to press B and box select all of these objects. Then we'll select the empty and then the wall right there. So now if we scale everything, make sure we switch this over to the individual origins, If we scale everything, here is the effect that we get. So what I'll do is on frame 340 here, we'll press K and add in a scale keyframe. We're gonna go 5 frames later, 345, press S and then go 1.05, so everything is scaled up slightly. Press K and then add in a scale keyframe again, and then we're gonna go another 5 frames later, press S and scale everything down to 0, enter, and then add in that last scale keyframe. And then of course we need to offset all of the animation. So on frame 340, we're gonna open up the Properties tab underneath the Commotion tab. Let's set the threshold up to, let's go with 5 objects. And then for the offset value, let's go down to 0.1. And the other very important thing is we wanna do selected only. So it's not gonna mess up any other keyframes that we've already added. It's only gonna do the ones that we have selected. And then make sure we select these keyframes right here. Now, if we go offset animation, we can see exactly what this looks like. You're gonna see that is looking pretty good. And if you don't really like how it looks, what you can do is just Control Z that a couple times, box select the different keyframes, maybe move them around a little bit, and then try it again. I also might drag the scale a little bit further away, so let's go with around 10 frames. We'll box select all of these objects, offset animation, and we'll see what this looks like now. And that looks a lot better, and we'll of course need to change the end frame a bit higher, and that is our final result. But there we go, that is how you create a satisfying isometric room animation in Blender. And again, if you want to grab the final scene from this tutorial and every tutorial I've ever created, feel free to check out my Patreon, the link is in the description. And if you are new, consider subscribing for future Blender tutorials, and big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.